The Galactic Council unleashed war. Humanity unleashed nightmares. The transmission came in while I was mid-sentence. I was standing in the middle of the diplomatic corridor on Council Station Oris 7, arguing with a supply coordinator named Colin about a missing crate of water filtration units, when every screen on the station switched to a single solid frequency. The lights dimmed automatically. That only happened for one reason. I turned around. The Great Seal of the Galactic Council filled every display panel along the corridor walls. Gold and silver rings, interlocked, representing 41 spacefaring civilizations. I had seen that seal on my credentials badge every single day for 6 years. Right now, looking at it, my stomach dropped to the floor. Colin went quiet beside me. The voice that followed was not a voice exactly. The Vorith do not produce sound the way humans do. What came through the speakers was a layered harmonic signal, translated in real time by the station's interpreter network into flat, emotionless standard. Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. The Galactic Council in session has completed its assessment of the human species designation H-Class 7. The assessment has been reviewed across 4 standard cycles. The conclusion is as follows. The human species represents an unacceptable and escalating probability of destabilization within the established galactic order. Population growth rate, territorial expansion velocity, psychological deviation index, and consistent noncompliance with population regulation protocols have each exceeded acceptable threshold parameters. Corrective measures have been proposed and declined 14 times over 40 years of diplomatic engagement. The Council has therefore voted, by a margin of 37-4, to authorize a full-class extinction correction event against the human species. Execution will begin within 1 standard cycle. 1 standard cycle, 11 days. I stood there in that corridor, holding a clipboard with a complaint form about water filters, and I could not move. Colin said my name. Oliver, he said it twice. I did not answer. I had been a human diplomatic liaison for 6 years. Before that, I had studied xenopolitics for 4 years at the Earth Council Institute, learning the 41 languages, the 41 sets of customs, the 41 ways of saying hello and thank you, and we come in peace. I had dedicated my entire adult life to the idea that communication was the bridge between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. That patience and reason and good faith would eventually earn us a seat at the table, not just a chair in the corner. 37-4. 4 species had voted against it. 37 had voted to end us. I started walking, not toward anything in particular, just walking because standing still felt like agreeing to something. The station was already changing around me. I could feel it in the air the way you feel a pressure shift before a storm. Alien crew members who normally nodded at me in the hallways were looking at the floor. A pair of Denthari officers stepped around me in a wide arc, as if proximity itself was now a liability. The council canteen, which I passed every morning, had its shutters down for the first time in 6 years. I pulled out my personal comm device and tried to reach the Earth diplomatic office on level 4. The line connected, held for 2 seconds and then dropped. I tried again, dropped again. On my 3rd attempt, a recorded message told me that diplomatic communication channels for H-class species were currently suspended pending procedural review. Suspended pending review. I put my comm away before I threw it against the wall. There was a small observation lounge at the far end of Corridor 9, a room mostly used by younger alien staff members who wanted to eat lunch with a view of the star field. It was empty now. I went inside, sat down in a chair by the viewport, and looked out at the stars while my brain tried to catch up with reality. 40 years. That was how long humanity had been part of the galactic community. 40 years of showing up, of learning the rules, of building relationships across species lines, of sending our best people to say our best words. 40 years of being watched, assessed, measured, and quietly looked down on by civilizations who had been sailing between stars for centuries before we had invented the printing press. We were always the new ones, the young ones, the loud ones. The Vorath, who had issued today's transmission, were 7,000 years old as a civilization. The Denthari had been exploring other star systems before humanity had figured out agriculture. Even the youngest species on the Council, the Relu, had been spacefaring for 300 years. And in all that time, in all those centuries of galactic civilization, not a single member species had ever been voted out of existence. Until today, until us. I heard the door behind me open. I did not turn around. Oliver. The voice belonged to Instructor Nerv. He was a Keth, one of the 4 species that had voted against the resolution. He was also the closest thing I had to a friend on this station, which tells you something about the general warmth of interspecies relations at this level of diplomacy. He sat down in the chair beside mine and folded his long fingers together in his lap. I want you to know that the Keth delegation formally objected. We will continue to object through every procedural channel available to us. 37-4, I said. Yes. They voted on it like they were approving a maintenance schedule. Nerv was quiet for a moment. The Council does not process decisions the way you do. There is no anger in it, no hatred. To them, this is a resource management problem with a calculated solution. That was somehow worse than if they had hated us. Hatred I could have argued against. You can appeal to hatred, you can address it, you can show someone why it is wrong. But arithmetic, how do you argue with a species that looks at 8 billion human lives and sees an equation? I need to send a message to Earth, I said. Diplomatic channels are suspended. I know that, I looked at him. I need to send a message to Earth, Nerv. He understood me then. He looked out at the stars for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, removed a small data chip and set it on the arm of my chair without a word. It was a Keth encrypted relay chip. It would bounce a signal through 3 unmapped relay points before reaching anywhere. Technically, it was not a diplomatic channel. Technically, if someone found it on me, it would end his career. I picked it up. It took me 40 minutes to find a private terminal and another 20 minutes to compress everything I needed into a message small enough to transmit on a covert chip. I did not write much. There was not much that needed saying. The Council has voted. The timeline is 11 days. They will come with everything. Wake up. I hit transmit. 14 seconds later, the door to the terminal room opened, and 4 Council security officers walked in. They were polite about it. That was the worst part. No raised voices, no rough handling. 2 of them simply stepped to either side of me and asked me, in perfectly translated standard, to come with them. One of them collected the terminal as evidence. Another picked up the data chip, which I had not had time to destroy. I thought about Nerv and felt a twist of guilt in my chest. They walked me down 4 levels and placed me in a holding room. Clean, plain, no windows. A table, 2 chairs, a water dispenser in the corner. The kind of room that is designed to be inoffensive and is more frightening for it. I sat down in one of the chairs and put my hands flat on the table. I had been trained for a lot of situations in my 6 years of service. Hostile negotiations, communication failures, cultural misunderstandings that could spiral into incidents. I had thick manuals about de-escalation and thick binders about protocol. Nobody had ever written a manual for sitting in a detention room, while the oldest civilization in the galaxy counted down to the end of your species. I thought about my sister, Claire, who lived in a small city in northern England and had 3 kids and sent me voice messages every Sunday. I thought about my father, who had cried when I got the appointment to Oris 7, not from sadness, but from a kind of stunned pride. I thought about the 8 billion people on a blue planet who were, right now, either receiving my warning or sleeping through the last few ordinary nights they would ever have. I thought about what I had said in the message. Wake up. And then I thought about what wake up really meant for us. What it meant for a species that had spent the last 40 years trying very hard to be calm and reasonable and measured. What it meant to reach back past all of that and find what was underneath. I thought about human history, not the cleaned-up version we present in interspecies summits, the real one, the long one. The Council had studied 40 years of diplomatic humanity. They had read our cultural reports and our science papers and our carefully worded treaty proposals. They had watched us sit at tables and speak in measured tones and follow every rule they set. They had no idea what we were like when we were not trying to impress anyone. I sat in that room with my hands flat on the table, and for the first time since I had heard that transmission, I was not afraid. I was something else entirely. The door to the holding room was reinforced plasteel, 2 inches thick, sealed with a magnetic lock and monitored by 2 cameras. I was alone, unarmed, and detained by the most powerful political body in the known galaxy. And I was smiling, because I had just realized something that the Galactic Council, with all its centuries and all its data and all its cold, precise arithmetic, had never once thought to calculate. We had sent them our diplomats, our reasonable people, our patient people. They had no idea what was coming next. I was in that holding room for 22 days before anything changed. They fed me. They gave me a sleeping mat. A junior council aide came by every morning and asked if I had any reasonable requests, which I thought was a strange question to ask someone you were holding while planning to eliminate their entire species. I always asked for better coffee. They always brought the same flat, gray liquid they had been bringing since day one. After a while, I stopped asking. I had nothing to do except think, so I thought. I thought about the message I had sent, whether it had arrived, whether 11 days had been long enough for Earth to begin doing anything meaningful, whether anything meaningful was even possible against a coalition that commanded 41 militaries and had been running coordinated space operations for longer than human civilization had existed. On day 12 of my detention, I heard something that answered at least part of that question. The station shook. Not violently, not the kind of shaking that cracks walls and sends equipment flying. Just a long, low vibration, like a bass note held too long, traveling up through the floor and into my chair and through my spine. It lasted about 4 seconds and then it stopped. I pressed my hand flat against the wall and waited. It happened again 3 hours later, then twice more before what I estimated to be midnight. Each time the vibration was slightly different. Different frequency, different duration. I am not an engineer, but I had spent 6 years on a space station and I knew what that station sounded like when nothing was wrong. This was not that. On day 14, the junior aide who brought my morning coffee looked different. He was a young Denthari, maybe the equivalent of 25 years old in human terms, and he had always carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who worked for the most powerful institution in the galaxy. That morning, he looked like someone who had not slept. His secondary eye membranes, which the Denthari keep down when they are relaxed, were partially raised, a stress signal. "Any reasonable requests?" he asked, same as every morning. "What was that vibration last night?" I said. He set down the coffee and picked up the empty cup from yesterday without answering. "It happened 4 times," I said, "different signatures each time." He went to the door. "Is it Earth?" I asked. He paused, just for a half-second, his back to me, hand on the door release. Then he left. That pause told me everything. 6 days after that, on day 22, a different person came to my room. Not an aide. A senior council intelligence officer named Vess of the Quareth species. The Quareth are tall, methodical, and impossible to read if you do not know their body language. I had spent 3 years learning Quareth body language. I read Vess the moment he sat down. He was unsettled. Not frightened. Not yet. but unsettled in the way a very experienced person gets when they encounter something they do not have a framework for. He placed a data display on the table between us and activated it without preamble. "You are Oliver Hart," he said. "6 years as human diplomatic liaison. Before that, xenopolitics training at the Earth Council Institute. Correct?" "Correct," I said. "We are going to show you some information. You are going to help us understand it." I looked at the display. It was showing tactical data, though most of the technical notation was in Quareth military format, which I only partially understood. What I could understand was the map overlay. It was showing 3 of Earth's outer defensive perimeters. The first 2 had large red markers. Engaged and overrun, I assumed. The third perimeter was different. The red advance had stopped at the 3rd line. Not cleanly, not neatly. It had stopped in a ragged, uneven pattern that, even through my limited reading of the notation, looked less like a defensive hold and more like something that had chewed the advance apart from multiple directions at once. "What happened at the 3rd perimeter?" I asked. Vess moved the display to show a different layer of data. Casualty projections versus actual results. I did not need to read Quareth military notation to understand the gap between those 2 lines. The projections were a smooth curve. The actual results were chaotic. "Our strike force entered the 3rd perimeter zone 4 days ago," Vess said. "Our initial projections, based on documented human military capacity and estimated material resources, suggested approximately 11 hours to full perimeter collapse. And 96 hours later, the perimeter has not collapsed. We have lost contact with 17 advance units. We have received fragmented communications from 6 others describing engagement scenarios that our tactical analysts have been unable to classify." I kept my face calm. Inside, something had caught fire. "Classify how?" I said. Vess tapped the display and brought up a communication transcript. Real-time field reports from his advance units, translated into standard. I read them slowly, taking in every line. The reports described traps, not the conventional kind, not the fortified bunker and artillery positions that any species would expect from a prepared military defense. These were different. Infrastructure the attacking units could not identify until they were already inside it. Routes that looked open and were not. Signals that mimicked council communication frequencies, drawing units into positions they believed were safe. Equipment that had been deliberately left in view to suggest a certain defensive posture, masking an entirely different one behind it. One report from a unit commander read, "The humans are not retreating from destroyed positions. They are incorporating destroyed positions into the engagement. There is no clear boundary between what they have lost and what they are using." I set the display down carefully. "You want me to explain this?" I said. "You are a human," Vess said. "You have access to contextual knowledge that our tactical analysts do not." I looked at him for a moment. A senior intelligence officer of one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, sitting across a table from a detained diplomat with bad coffee, asking me to help him understand why his fleet was having trouble. I thought carefully about what to say, and then I decided to tell him the truth. "Your tactical analysts modeled human military capability based on the last 2 centuries of Earth history," I said. "That is the period during which humans have been in the galactic community. Active diplomacy, international cooperation, reduction of internal conflicts, progressive disarmament. The data from that period is accurate." "Then why does it not match what we are observing?" "Because 200 years is not very long," I said. "Humans have been fighting each other and everything else for approximately 10,000 years. We developed tactics, strategies, and methods across centuries of internal conflict on a single planet with no outside intervention, no galactic framework, no rules of engagement that every party agreed to. We had to be creative because We were always fighting someone at roughly equal technological levels. You cannot win those wars by being straightforward. You win them by being unpredictable. Vess was very still. When your forces hit our first and second perimeters, you saw the military we showed you during 40 years of diplomatic engagement. Organized, documented, calibrated to galactic standards. What you are seeing now at the third perimeter is something else. What is it? It is what we actually are, I said, when we stop trying to look civilized and start trying to survive. Vess picked up the display and looked at it again. I watched him process what I had said. The Quarath are not easily disturbed. He was disturbed. There is another anomaly, he said after a long pause. He pulled up a separate file, audio this time, with a visual signal waveform. This is a recording from one of our field commanders. He is observing a human unit that has been under continuous fire for approximately 18 hours with no resupply. They have taken significant losses. Their position is structurally compromised. He played the audio. For the first few seconds, I heard the sound of active combat in the background, the distant percussion of weapons fire, something collapsing. And then, cutting through all of it, a sound that made Vess watch my face very carefully. Laughter, a human voice laughing, not hysterical, not panicked, just laughing the way you laugh when something is absurd, when the universe has done something so extreme that the only honest response is to find it funny. The audio ended. Our field commander reported that this was repeated among multiple members of the unit, Vess said. It disrupted his assessment. He could not determine whether the unit was experiencing psychological collapse or communicating in a code pattern. It was neither, I said. Then what was it? I looked at the table for a moment, trying to find the right words for something that I had grown up with and never had to explain to anyone. When humans reach a point where the rational outcome looks very bad, some of us do something that may seem irrational from the outside. We let go of the outcome. We stop calculating the result and we focus entirely on the action. When that happens, we become very difficult to predict because we are no longer trying to win in any conventional sense. We are operating on a completely different framework. What framework? Stubbornness, I said. The decision that we are going to make this as hard as possible, regardless of what happens to us. Not because we expect to survive it, just because we refuse to make it easy for the other side. Vess was quiet for a long time. That is not a rational military doctrine, he said. No, I agreed. It is not. That is why your analysts did not model for it. He stood up. He collected the display. He went to the door and then paused there, and I recognized the gesture because I had seen it twice now from two different species, and it meant the same thing both times. He wanted to say something that was not in any official report. Oliver Hart, he said. In the Council's assessment, the primary reason your species was classified as a destabilization risk was your psychological deviation index. Your emotional responses, your unpredictability, your refusal to conform to standard behavioral models. I know, I said. It was listed as a weakness. I said nothing. Vess left. I picked up the cold gray coffee and sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my plain, clean, inoffensive holding room. Somewhere out there, on a planet I had not seen in 2 years, my species was doing what my species had always done when everything went wrong. Not giving up, not calculating the odds and surrendering to them, just putting their heads down and refusing to stop. The Council had studied 40 years of humanity and seen a species trying very hard to be something acceptable. They had classified our oldest instincts as a defect, a weakness, a deviation from the rational norm. They were about to find out what that deviation actually looked like when it had 11 days of warning and nothing left to lose. Outside the station, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and countless and completely indifferent to the outcome. I was not cold, I was not indifferent. I finished the terrible coffee and waited for whatever came next. On the 31st day, they moved me. No explanation. 2 officers, same polite tone, a longer walk this time through parts of the station I had never been permitted to access. We went up 6 levels, passed through 2 security checkpoints, and stopped at a door I recognized from architectural briefings I had studied years ago when I first arrived at Oris 7. The Intelligence Review Chamber. It was a circular room with a domed ceiling and a central oval table large enough to seat 20. The walls were lined with display panels, and every single one of them was active. Data, maps, transmission logs, signal intercepts, a cascade of information moving faster than I could absorb it all at once. Around the table sat 7 individuals representing 5 different species. Council Intelligence Leadership. Not aides, not junior officers. The people who actually ran the information architecture of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. They looked at me the way you look at something you are not sure is safe. One of them spoke. She was Veth, a species known for directness, which I had always appreciated in the 900 diplomatic interactions of my career. Her name was Coordinator Alina. Sit down, Oliver Hart. You are here because your presence was requested by Intelligence Lead Vess, and because the Council believes you may provide useful interpretive context. I sat down. I looked around the room and caught something that stopped my thoughts mid-sentence. Every display panel was showing Earth, not the whole planet, specific zones, specific engagements, specific data points from what was clearly an ongoing, active military operation that was not going according to any plan in this room. I kept my expression neutral and started reading everything I could. We will be direct with you, Alina said. Our operation against Earth has progressed into its 3rd phase. Phases 1 and 2 proceeded within acceptable variance from projections. Phase 3 has not. Tell me about Phase 3, I said. She gestured to the display to her left. It expanded to show a grid of engagement zones across what I recognized as the mid-northern hemisphere of Earth, Western Europe, Scandinavia, parts of North Africa, and the near-orbit zones above them. The Council Advance Force had moved through the first 2 defensive layers in the first 11 days, which was presumably what they had projected. The 3rd layer had now been active for 20 days. The map looked like someone had taken the Council's neat tactical advance and put it through a machine that had no interest in neatness at all. There were gaps where there should have been solid movement. There were Council-marked positions that were showing conflicting status signals, some classified as secured, with simultaneous reports from within them describing ongoing resistance. There were areas where the advance had split in ways that did not match any standard flanking pattern, which meant the human forces were not where the models predicted they would be. Your ground forces are no longer behaving in a coordinated pattern consistent with a central command structure, Alina said. Our tactical division has concluded this means their command infrastructure has been damaged. Has it? I said. She looked at me. Is that question meant to suggest otherwise? I am asking whether your tactical division considered the alternative interpretation, I said, which is that they are doing it deliberately. Silence around the table. I continued. Decentralized command under pressure is not new to human military doctrine. There are historical periods in Earth's past, long before spaceflight, where military units were specifically trained to operate autonomously for extended periods without centralized direction. Because centralized command is a target. If you remove the center, the units in the field continue to operate according to pre-established protocols. You cannot cut the head off something that has already distributed its decision-making across every individual in the unit. Alina exchanged a look with the Quareth officer beside her. Then she moved to the next display. This is a communications intercept from 48 hours ago, she said. A transmission originating from a location we had classified as a neutralized population center. Neutralized. The word hit me in a specific way. I did not let it show. The transmission was not in any coded military format. It was civilian band, open frequency. It was a list of names. I looked at the display. She was right. It was a transmission log, and the content was exactly what she described. Names, hundreds of them, first names, last names, the names of places I recognized. Cities, towns, small settlements. "We do not understand the tactical purpose," Alina said. "It does not convey military information. It does not communicate coordinates or resource status or strategic intent. It is names." I understood immediately what it was, but I said nothing yet. Following the transmission, 3 Council strike units in the surrounding zones reported a simultaneous increase in engagement intensity. Not a coordinated assault, a diffuse, multi-point pressure increase with no single origin. Our units could not identify a command signal that preceded it. I nodded slowly. "The names were not tactical communication," I said. "They were something else." "Explain." I thought for a moment about how to say this to a room full of beings whose civilizations had been largely at peace for centuries, who had not had to think about what it feels like to hear the names of your people read aloud by someone who refuses to let them be forgotten. "When humans are in a situation that looks unwinnable," I said, "sometimes the only thing that keeps a unit moving is being reminded of who and what they are fighting for, not in an abstract way, specifically, by name. It is not a coded signal. It is a psychological one. It tells every human within range of that broadcast that the people who did not survive are being remembered, and it tells them that continuing is how you honor that." The room was quiet in a way that was different from the usual diplomatic quiet I had spent years navigating. This was not careful quiet. This was the quiet of people who had encountered something they did not fully understand and were not sure they wanted to understand. The Denthari officer at the far end of the table leaned forward. His name was Senior Analyst Bram, and I recognized him from his file. 14 years in Council Military Intelligence. "Does this work?" he asked. His tone was not dismissive. It was genuinely curious in the flat, analytical way of someone who wants data. "Does reminding soldiers of the dead increase their tactical effectiveness?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" I looked at him. "Because humans are not purely rational actors. You already know this. It is in our assessment file. Our psychological deviation index is the reason this operation was approved in the first place. What the assessment file does not capture is that our emotional responses do not only create unpredictability, they also create a kind of durability that cannot be calculated from the outside. A human unit that is fighting for rational reasons, resource defense, strategic position, survival odds, will reach a point where the rational calculation says to stop. A human unit that is fighting for a reason they feel will not stop when the calculation says to. They will stop when they decide to stop, and you cannot predict when that is." Bram wrote something down. He actually wrote it down on physical notation material, which told me it was something he did not want in the digital record. Alina returned to the central display. "There is one more anomaly I want you to address." She pulled up video footage, not a map or data overlay, actual footage from what looked like a Council ground unit's field recorder. The image was grainy and the angle was low, looking across broken terrain toward a series of damaged structures. In the footage, a small group of humans was moving through the wreckage of what had been a building of some kind. They were not running. They were not taking defensive positions. They were moving with a focused, deliberate calm that, I could see from the body language of the Council soldiers filming it, was confusing and unnerving the observers. One of the humans stopped, looked directly toward the camera position, raised one hand in a small, casual wave, and kept moving. They knew they were being watched. They did not care. This footage has been reviewed by 3 separate behavioral analysis teams, Alina said. None of them has produced a satisfactory explanation for why a unit in a compromised zone, aware of observation by an opposing force, would respond with a casual social greeting. I almost laughed. I controlled it. They are telling you they are not afraid of being watched, I said. The wave is not a social greeting in this context. It is a statement. It means they know you are there, they know you are watching, and the fact of being watched has no effect on what they intend to do next. It is a form of psychological pressure in reverse. Instead of them being intimidated by your observation, they are making you aware that your observation changes nothing. The room absorbed this. In our experience, I continued, the most effective tool against an opponent that relies on calculated, rational strategy is an opponent that communicates clearly and consistently. That calculation will not help you predict them. The wave is not friendly. It is a statement of intent. It says, we are not going to behave the way your models say we should, and we want you to know that we know that. Alina looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the other officers around the table. Something passed between them that I was not meant to read, but I was very good at reading rooms after 6 years of diplomacy. They were discussing, without speaking, whether to continue the operation. I knew it with certainty the way you know certain things, when you have spent years learning to read people who are trying not to be read. There is a question I would like to ask you, I said. Alina looked back at me. Ask. Your original projection for this operation was full completion within 60 standard days, I said. It was a guess based on the data I had absorbed from the displays. From the look on Bram's face, it was an accurate guess. You are now at day 31. How has your revised projection changed? Alina did not answer immediately. It has changed significantly, she said. In which direction? Another pause. Upward. By how much? Bram spoke quietly from the end of the table. Our current models are no longer producing stable projections, he said. The variance has exceeded the range in which a projection is considered operationally reliable. I sat with that for a moment. Their models had broken, not because Earth had a bigger fleet or more advanced technology, because the thing they were fighting did not behave consistently enough to model, because every time they built a new projection, the humans they were projecting about did something that fell outside the parameters of the last one. What do you need from me? I said. We need you to tell us when it ends, Alina said. At what point does a human force accept that the optimal outcome is no longer achievable and adjust its behavior toward a rational conclusion? I looked at her, at Bram, at the 7 of them around that table. I cannot tell you that, I said. Why not? Because for a significant portion of human history, the answer to that question has been never. There is no universal threshold. There is no calculation I can give you. Some human forces have continued fighting for years after any rational analysis would have declared the cause lost. Some have continued after the cause was, by every external measure, completely and irreversibly gone, not because they were irrational, but because they had decided that the act of continuing was the point, regardless of the result. The room was very quiet again. Somewhere on those display panels, real-time data was still flowing. Engagement reports, signal intercepts, the ongoing, unresolved, increasingly unpredictable shape of a conflict that the most powerful governing body in the galaxy had expected to resolve in 60 days and had not. I want to be very clear about something, I said, and I kept my voice even and calm, the voice of 6 years of diplomatic training, the voice of patience and reason and good faith. You voted to end my species, 37-4. You called it a corrective measure. You approached it the way you approach arithmetic. I understand why. I understand your framework. I even understand the logic from inside that framework. Nobody spoke. But there is something your framework does not contain, I said. And that is the variable of what happens when you tell 8 billion people that their existence has been voted on, when you reduce them to a calculation, when you make it clear that the conversation is over and the decision has already been made. Alina watched me with complete stillness. "You don't get arithmetic back after that," I said. "You get something older, something that your assessment files and your behavioral models and your deviation index scores cannot quantify, because it has never had to be quantified before. No one has ever studied what humans are like when we have genuinely, completely nothing left to prove to anyone." I stopped there. The data on the walls kept moving. The clock on the session panel read day 31 of the operation. None of the projections in this room were stable. And somewhere out there, in the wreckage of a planet that had been given 11 days of warning and chose to use every second of it, someone was waving at a camera and not losing any sleep over it. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Whatever they decided next, they were going to have to make a new model for it. They did not have one. On the 44th day, I stopped counting. Not because nothing was happening. The opposite. Too much was happening too fast, and the intelligence review chamber had become the only room on the station where anyone was actually getting accurate information. I had become a fixture in it, which was not something either side had planned for, but which had happened because I was useful, and when a crisis is deep enough, usefulness overrides everything else. I sat at that oval table every day now, not as a prisoner exactly. The word they used was consultant, which was diplomatic language for, we do not know what we are looking at and we need someone who does. I was not free. I could not leave the station. I had no official status and no formal authority, but I was in the room, and the room was where the war was being run, and being in the room taught me things that no detention cell ever could. What I learned in those days changed something in me. I had spent 6 years building my understanding of the galaxy on a framework of diplomacy, of the idea that rational actors, given enough time and information, would arrive at reasonable conclusions. That patient effort accumulated into progress. That the future was a place where humanity and the rest of the galaxy would find equilibrium. I still believed parts of that, but I had learned something sharper. Sometimes the only reason a rational actor changes course is because the alternative becomes too expensive. Not morally wrong, not ethically indefensible, just too expensive to continue. And sometimes the only way to make something too expensive is to be the kind of problem that cannot be resolved on a budget. Earth had become that kind of problem. I watched it happen in real time, day by day, through the data on those display panels. The Council had committed a force to this operation that, by any historical standard, should have been more than sufficient. The numbers were overwhelming. The technology gap was real. On paper, this should have been over in 60 days or fewer. But Earth had turned every day past 60 into a question the Council had not planned to answer, and the question kept getting louder. On day 47, the Council received a request for emergency consultation from 3 member species who had not been publicly vocal about the operation. 2 of them were mid-tier members whose home systems were, I noted quietly, within the general spatial range of human expansion. The third was a senior member species called the Relin, whose trade networks ran through 14 systems, 4 of which had human colonial settlements that were now, presumably, part of the ongoing operational zone. The consultations were held behind closed doors. I was not in those rooms, but I could read the shift in the intelligence chamber after they happened. The conversations around that table changed, shorter, more careful, more aware of something that had not been a factor before, consequences. The Council had designed this operation as a controlled, finite procedure, a correction, as they had called it, a thing with a beginning, a middle, and a clean end. What they had not designed for was a correction that kept generating new problems the longer it continued, disrupted trade routes, diplomatic friction with species that had existing relationships with human settlements. The growing, visible, impossible-to-ignore question of why the most powerful body in the galaxy was still engaged in a conflict that was now past its projected completion date by 30 days and climbing. And then on day 51, the thing happened that changed everything. I was in the chamber when the signal came in. It was flagged Priority 1, which in Council intelligence language meant it was something that had no precedent category. Alina opened it with Bram at her shoulder, and I watched both of their faces do something I had never seen them do in 7 weeks of working in that room together. They went still in the specific way that very composed people go still, when they need a moment to process something before they allow themselves to react. I moved closer to the display. The signal was from a Council monitoring post at the edge of the home system, not Earth system, the Council's own, the Vorith home system, the center of galactic governance for 4,000 years. A human vessel had entered the outer monitoring range. One ship, small, running on what the sensor logs described as a mismatched engine configuration, not a standard drive, something cobbled together from components that, when Bram pulled up the identification analysis, matched parts from at least 3 different ship classes, none of them human in origin. It should not have been there. Getting through 3 rings of Council defensive infrastructure between Earth and the Vorith system without triggering a single automated interdiction was, as Bram put it in a tone that was trying very hard to remain analytical, operationally implausible. The ship did not fire. It did not approach the Vorith homeworld. It did not attempt to dock with any station or platform. It entered the outer monitoring zone, matched a geostationary position relative to the homeworld, and opened a broadcast on every Council standard frequency simultaneously. I recognized the format immediately. Civilian band, open signal, no encryption. A human voice read names for 40 minutes. I sat very still through all 40 minutes. Alina sat very still. Bram sat very still. The entire intelligence chamber, 7 senior officers from 5 species, sat very still and listened to a human voice read the names of every settlement, every city, every populated zone that the Council operation had engaged since day 1. Not casualty numbers, not statistics, names, the names of places where people had lived. When the broadcast ended, the ship turned around and left. It cleared the outer monitoring zone before any interdiction response could be coordinated. Later analysis, which I was shown, determined that the entry route the ship had used involved 3 successive navigation decisions that the Council's defensive network models rated as between 7 and 12% probability of success each, which meant the combined probability of making all 3 successfully was less than 1%. They had done it anyway. 1 ship, 1 crew. Somewhere in the intelligence assessment file, someone had written the word reckless and then visibly considered it and replaced it with deliberate. The Council chamber was silent for a long time after the playback ended. Then Alina said very quietly, "They chose not to fire." "Yes," I said. "They were in range." "Yes." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a Veth before. Something between technical respect and something older, the look of someone standing at the edge of a body of water and reconsidering whether they want to go in. "They wanted us to understand that they chose not to," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes," I said. "That is the message, not the names. The names are for the record, the message is the choice. The message is we were here, we could have, we did not. Think about why." Bram, who I had come to understand over weeks of observation, was the most coldly analytical mind in this room, put down his notation material very carefully and said, in a tone that was stripped of all professional insulation, "What do they want?" It was the first time anyone in that room had asked that question. In 7 weeks, the first time anyone had asked what the other side wanted, because the operation had been designed as a termination event, not a negotiation, and termination events do not include a step where you ask what the other side wants. They want to be treated as people, I said, not as a calculation. We cannot simply, Alina began. I know, I said. I am not asking you to. I am answering the question I was asked. What do they want? That is what they want. Everything else, the military posture, the name broadcasts, the ship in your home system, those are just the shapes that wanting takes when every other option has been closed off. The silence that followed lasted almost 3 minutes. I know because I watched the session timer on the wall. Then Bram said something that surprised me. 3 member species have opened private channels to human colonial representatives in the last 4 days, he said. He was not looking at Alina when he said it. He was looking at me. The communications have not been officially logged through council infrastructure. He was telling me this on purpose. Alina's posture shifted by a fraction. She had not told me to leave the room. The crack in the council was real. It had been forming since day 30, since the model stopped being stable, since the operation went past 60 days and kept going. The ship in the home system had not created the crack. It had made it visible to everyone in this room who had been pretending not to see it. I looked at the display, still showing the empty space where the human vessel had been. One ship, cobbled together from 3 different classes of stolen parts, navigating through a defensive grid on less than 1% odds. Because they had decided the outcome did not matter, only the act. I thought about what I had said to Vess weeks ago, about the laughter from the field audio, about humans who had let go of the calculation and operated on stubbornness instead. I had explained it to him as a military phenomenon. But it was not only military. That ship, that crew, the 40 minutes of names on open frequency in the middle of the most defended system in the galaxy, was the same thing. It was the act of people who had decided that making you understand was worth more than any risk attached to the making. You cannot put a price on that. You cannot run it through a model. You cannot calculate when it stops because the people doing it are not calculating. 3 member species were talking to human colonists. The projections had been unreliable for 30 days. On the display panel to my left, the real-time engagement data from Earth was still flowing. Still messy, still outside parameters, still refusing to resolve into the clean conclusion the operation had been designed to produce. I thought about my sister Claire in northern England, about her 3 children, about the voice messages she sent every Sunday. I thought about whether she was in one of the zones on that map. I had not let myself think about that for 7 weeks because thinking about it would have made me useless in this room, and being useless in this room was the one thing I could not afford. I let myself think about it now. And then I put it away. Because the room had shifted, and there was work to do. Alina was looking at me with the expression of a person who has reached the edge of what their existing framework can hold and is deciding, in real time, whether to build a new one or step back from the edge. If a dialogue were to be proposed, she said, choosing every word with extreme care, through channels that are not currently open through official council infrastructure, and if that dialogue were to be oriented toward a mutual reassessment of the current operational status, what would be required from the human side to begin such a dialogue? I almost smiled. A senior council intelligence coordinator, in the most careful diplomatic language possible, had just asked me how to start a ceasefire conversation without officially admitting they wanted a ceasefire. 6 years of training had not been wasted after all. You would need to release me, I said, and you would need to give me access to a secure, non-council communications relay. She looked at Bram. He gave a single small nod. That, Alina said, can be arranged. I stood up from the table for the first time in a different way than I had sat down. I had sat down as a consultant, a useful tool, A human in the room because someone needed someone to explain the humans. I stood up as something else. The display panels were still showing Earth, still showing the engagement zones and the data that would not resolve, and the signal logs and the mess, and the noise of a species that refused to behave like it was supposed to. Somewhere in that mess, people were still fighting, still transmitting names, still waving at cameras. I was going to find a way to bring them home. They gave me a room with a window. It was a small detail and a large one. For 44 days I had been in a room without windows. The first morning in the new room, I sat in the chair by the viewport and watched the light from the Vorath sun fall across the station hull and thought, they are showing me something. They are showing me that the framing has changed. I was not a prisoner. I was not a consultant. I was, as of that morning, the acting head of an unofficial human delegation that did not officially exist, conducting talks that the Council had not officially proposed, toward a resolution that nobody on either side had officially acknowledged was necessary. The galaxy runs on official acknowledgement. Most of what actually determines its direction happens in the space between official positions, in the rooms without labels, in the conversations that get summarized later in language that makes them sound inevitable and tidy. I had spent 6 years watching that process from the outside. Now I was inside it, with no team, no formal mandate, and a communications relay that Bram had personally configured to route through 2 neutral systems before reaching anyone on Earth. My first transmission went out on what I had come to think of as day 1 of the new situation. I kept it short. I identified myself. I gave my current location and status. I explained in plain language what I believed the Council's actual position was, as distinct from what they would say officially. I described what I had observed in the intelligence chamber over the previous 7 weeks. I outlined what I thought was possible. Then I waited. The response came 11 hours later. It was not from Earth's central government. It was from a woman named Kate Albright, who I did not know, from a region of Earth I associated with agricultural settlements and cold winters. She had, apparently, become part of the informal coordinating network that Earth had assembled after the first 11 days, when centralized command became a liability. Her title, insofar as she had one, was something like Regional Communications Lead, which was bureaucratic language for. She was the person who kept information moving when the infrastructure for moving it had been damaged. She wrote in the same plain, short way I had written. She confirmed receipt. She confirmed that my transmission had reached people who needed to receive it. She said, and I am reconstructing this from memory because I was not permitted to keep printed copies, that there were people on Earth who had been looking for exactly this kind of channel for several weeks, and that my timing was either very good or very lucky. I wrote back probably both. She wrote back probably. We talked every day after that, not about grand strategy, about specifics, what the Council needed to hear to make a ceasefire proposal internally viable, what Earth needed to see before its informal coordinating network would accept any suspension of its current posture, the small, real, technical problems of building a bridge between 2 sides that had not planned to need a bridge. It was, in structure, the most ordinary diplomatic process I had ever been part of. It was also the most consequential, and I was running it alone, from a room with a window, using a relay that officially did not exist, talking to a woman who officially had no title, on behalf of a species that had officially been targeted for elimination, and a governing body that had officially not changed its position. The 37-4 vote was still on the record. Nobody had rescinded it. That was going to be a problem. I raised it with Alina on day 6 of the new situation. We met in a small conference room, just the 2 of us, a container of something warm that I had stopped trying to identify by smell, and a data pad with nothing on it, because nothing that happened in that room was going to be written down yet. The vote, I said. Yes, she said. It cannot be the starting point for any formal dialogue, I said. It has to be addressed before anything formal can begin, not reversed, not necessarily, but addressed. Addressing it formally requires a council session, she said. I know. A council session on this topic, at this time, with the current state of the operation, would produce a public record of a debate that several member species do not want on the public record. I know that too, I said. What about informally? She looked at me over her warm drink. Define informally. A statement, I said. Not a reversal of the vote, not an admission. A statement that the Council has initiated a review of the operational status of the action taken under the resolution. That's procedurally accurate. The review is happening. You are reviewing the operation every day in the intelligence chamber. You just have to say so out loud on record. Which gives Earth's coordinating network something to point to that allows them to justify a suspension of their current posture to the people they're coordinating. She thought about it for a long time. That statement, she said, would require support from at least 9 member species to be issued under Council authority. How many do you have? Another pause, currently 7. Who are you missing? She named 2 species. I knew both of them. I had spent 6 years at this station developing relationships. Not all of them had survived the last 7 weeks, but some had. Give me 4 days, I said. I want to be clear about what the next 4 days were. They were not dramatic. They were not the kind of thing that makes for a compelling story when retold. They were careful, quiet, methodical conversations conducted through back-channel messages with 2 species delegations who each had their own reasons for hesitation, their own internal politics, their own concerns about what they would be seen to be endorsing. The first delegation, the Pelith, had trade interests they were worried about. I had to understand those interests precisely, explain why a stabilized outcome served them better than a prolonged operational engagement, and do it in a way that gave their representatives something to bring back to their own council that looked like a win. The second delegation, the Moor, had a different concern. They had voted with the majority. Going to 9 required them to associate themselves with a position that was, in the gentlest possible reading, a reconsideration of that majority. I had to find a framing that allowed them to support the review statement without implying that their original vote had been in error. Diplomacy is mostly this, mostly finding the sentence that lets everyone in the room feel they have not lost something. On day 4, I had 9. Alina filed the statement the following morning. It was 8 sentences long. It said, in the careful, layered language of council procedure, that the operational status of the action taken under Resolution 7H was under active review, that the review was ongoing, that the Council remained committed to the principles of galactic stability, that all relevant parties had been informed. 8 sentences, 44 words of actual operational content. Kate Albright sent me 3 words in response. Good, keep going. The next 30 days were the architecture, the actual terms. This is where it got hard because terms require specificity, and specificity requires both sides to say, on record, what they actually need. That is always the hardest moment in any negotiation. The moment when you have to stop speaking in safe generalities and say the actual thing. Earth's side was clear. Full sovereignty, recognized and encoded in Council legal framework. Removal of all population regulation requirements for H-class species. Formal representation in Council governance, not observer status, actual voting representation. And a public acknowledgement entered into the permanent galactic record of what had occurred. That last one was the hardest for the Council, not the sovereignty, not the representation, though that was a significant structural change that required amending 2 founding documents. The acknowledgement, the on-record, permanent, unremovable fact that the Galactic Council had voted to end a species and had been wrong to do so. Alina and I went around that point for 9 days. On the 9th day, I stopped being diplomatic about it. It has to be in the record, I said, not as punishment, not as humiliation, as a fact, so that the next time a species is brought before the Council for a classification review, there is a precedent on record for what happens when the review process fails. That is not a demand for revenge. That is a structural improvement to your own governance. You should want it in the record. She was quiet for a long time. You have thought about this for a long time, she said. I had 44 days in a room with no windows, I said. She almost smiled. It was a Veth expression, subtle, a change in the secondary facial muscles, and I had spent enough time with her to read it. We will need to discuss the language of the acknowledgement, she said. Of course, I said, that is what we are here for. The signing happened on a morning that was, by the station's internal clock, early. I had not slept. I do not think Alina had either. Bram arrived with his notation material and sat at the end of the table in his usual spot and looked at the final document with the expression of someone reviewing a piece of work that is finished and correct and still somehow surprising. There were 9 of us in the room. 5 council species, myself, Kate Albright via secure relay on a screen at the far end of the table, and 2 representatives from the 3 species that had moved from council alignment to a neutral human relationship over the previous weeks. We read through the document one final time. Nobody had suggested changes in 48 hours, which in diplomatic terms means everyone has decided to stop suggesting changes. Kate confirmed Earth's coordinating network acceptance. Alina confirmed council procedural validity. We signed it. There was no ceremony. A document became a different kind of document, and the war that had been running for 61 days was now, officially, under suspension pending the full implementation of terms, which would take another year of detailed procedural work, and which I was probably going to be doing from a room on this station for most of that year. But the names would stop, and the ships would stop, and the data on those display panels would stop updating with engagement reports and signal intercepts from a planet that had been given 11 days of warning and had used every single one of them. The junior council aide who had brought me coffee every morning for 44 days came into the room after the signing and placed a container of something warm in front of me. I picked it up, smelled it, and stopped. It was actual coffee. Real coffee, the kind that had a smell that reached back past 6 years of station life and 44 days of detention, and 40 more days of the hardest work I had ever done in my life. I looked up at him. He did not explain where he had found it. He just went back to his position by the door. I drank it slowly. After everyone else had filed out, I sat alone at the oval table in the intelligence review chamber and looked at the display panels. Most of them were off now, or cycling through routine monitoring data, the quiet background noise of a station that was returning by degrees to something like normal operation. One panel was still showing Earth, real time, not engagement data, just the planet itself from a high orbital relay, the slow turn of it in the dark, the shapes of the continents, the white and blue and brown of a world that had been given 11 days and had turned 11 days into 61, and had made those 61 days count in ways that would be studied. I was absolutely certain by every species in the galaxy for the next several centuries. I thought about Kate Albright, who was probably sleeping for the first time in weeks. I thought about the crew of that one ship, the cobbled-together vessel that had navigated through a less than 1% probability, and parked in the home system and read names for 40 minutes, and then turned around and left. I thought about the soldier who had waved at the camera. I thought about the laughter in the field audio, the laughter that had unsettled a council admiral in a way that no military threat had managed to. I thought about my sister Claire and her 3 children. I thought about my father. I stood up, put the coffee container down on the table, and walked to the viewport at the far end of the room. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been, the same ones I had watched from the observation lounge on day one, when I had sat alone after hearing a 37-4 vote delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of a routine administrative decision. They had not changed. We had. Not in the way the council had expected. They had expected this to prove that humanity was exactly as dangerous as their assessment had classified us, that we would confirm the calculation, that the 40 years of diplomatic humanity had been a thin coating over something that needed to be removed. They were partly right. The coating was thin, what was underneath was real. But what they had not understood, what the assessment files and the deviation indices, and the 40 years of watching our careful, patient, reasonable diplomatic face had not prepared them for, was that the underneath was not only what they had feared. It was also this: a person sitting at a table for 60 days, building a bridge one careful sentence at a time, looking for the framing that lets everyone feel they have not lost something, finding the 9 out of 41, making the argument that puts the acknowledgement in the permanent record not as punishment, but as a structural improvement to your own governance. We were both of those things, the laughter and the diplomacy, the wave at the camera and the 8 sentences that said without saying that something had to change, the ship in the home system and the careful daily messages to Kate Albright about trade interest framing for the Pelith delegation. We were not what they had classified us as. We were not a deviation from the rational norm. We were something they did not have a category for. And that, I realized, standing at the viewport while the planet turned below, was exactly the point. They had called us nightmares. We signed the peace treaty. Both things were true. Both things were ours. Outside, a colony ship was visible in the far distance, a small moving point of light heading somewhere new. I watched it until I could not see it anymore. Then I went to find better coffee.